proposals. He claims Harris wants, quote, Soviet-style price controls. But while he knocks her agenda, Trump has yet to release details of his economic plan, despite holding 2 speeches this week on the economy. He's going to give it another shot on Monday when he counter-programs the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, so perhaps the 3rd time's a charm. Joining me now, congressional reporter for Axios, Julie Grace Brufke, Trump 2020 press communications director Erin Perini, and CNN political commentator and Democratic strategist Maria Cardona. So thank you all for coming in tonight. And first, I want to start with our reporter, because you have seen some of these proposals before, right? So it's not as though a new Congress would be like, what, expanding a tax credit for, families? What does it mean for whether or not this is more or less just Biden policies? Does it actually feel new?
And I think both sides, both Trump and Harris, are kind of leaning into this populist messaging. And some of the things they're talking about, the no tax on tips and things like the $6,000 child tax credit, which was kind of similar to the $5,000 child tax credit that J.D. Vance talked about, which were similar. But I think you're really going to hear a lot of Republicans kind of hammering home how are they going to pay for some of these proposals, like things like the $25,000 first-time homebuyer proposal that Harris put out there. And what she, these have been kind of been broad-stroke proposals that she's put out there, and whether she'll tackle that if she ends up getting elected via executive order, whether it'll be legislative, which might be a tougher lift with tight majorities, kind of remains to be seen there.
And we're saying populist. In a way, I kind of think popular. Maria, right? Like, people are mad right now that their rents are high.
Right.
People are like, these are issues that have been percolating for a time. So can you talk about how she is trying to distinguish herself?
Absolutely. I think what she has done is incredibly savvy, Audie, because she has been part of the administration. And frankly, it's an administration that has put forward economic proposals that actually pull off the charts. They're incredibly popular. But the frustration from the Biden administration has been that people aren't really feeling it because of inflation, because of the high costs. So here comes Kamala Harris. She is expanding what the Biden administration has done in terms of expanding opportunities for the middle class. But she's talking in a way where people really feel it. The increased cost at the grocery store.
So is it the messaging that's different? Because the Biden messaging was very like, hey, the numbers are actually great.
Exactly. That's the difference. And frankly, on a macroeconomic level, the numbers are great. But that doesn't really matter to people if they're not going to feel it in their own economies. And so incredibly savvy for her to do that. It is something that is very relevant to people. And the contrast with Donald Trump, who through his Project 2025, because he hasn't really talked about anything else, economists have said that if he imposes what he wants to do, it's going to explode inflation, impose massive taxes on the middle class. And that's a great contrast for her.
Let me jump in here because, Erin, I think that Republicans have been saying for a long time, you can't just say the economy is good if people aren't feeling that it's good. But checking your tweets, your social media, you were calling this agenda, you said we've seen this kind of thing tried in lots of other countries before, Venezuela, Argentina, and the Soviet Union. It leads to shortages. I don't want to take you out of context, but where is this line of criticism going for Republicans? Because we are hearing it.
One, I will say that's a retweet. That's not a direct.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that was not directly.
I mean, retweets aren't.
They aren't endorsements, but it is
They're
showing
endorsement adjacent.
But you know what? It's showing what Republicans are trying to say here, which is they've used it before as a messaging tool to say this is communism, this is socialism. You saw Trump talk about that in the 2020 cycle. You saw him use that aggressively as a political message, especially in Florida, where there are a lot of immigrants who came from communist and socialist nations.
But does that work beyond the base? You know what I mean?
No.
It's kind of like when you hear people say they're going to be fascist, and it's like, yeah, there's someone who definitely understands the definition of fascism and is very moved by that. Whereas I feel like if you feel like the cost of milk is high and then someone says, what, don't do anything about that, you're a communist, it like makes it feels like a bigger leap.
There are better ways for Republicans to message the economy than to use verbose, over-the-top language about Venezuela. But this is where the messaging is going, which is why I was highlighting it.
Okay.
But what I will say is the better way to talk about it, and I do agree with you here, is that make it personal. I was listening to NPR the other morning, and they had a woman on who was saying that now because the price has gone up so much, a bag of chips is now a luxury item for her at the grocery store. That's how you message how the Biden economy has failed people. You make it relatable. You make it something that is tangible. And yes, there are people, and certainly sects of a swing population and votes that Trump is going to want to bring on board where the Venezuela and Russia and communist kind of language will work. That is not the broad strokes we should be brushing with when we are trying to talk about the economic failures that the American people feel under the Biden-Harris administration.
You know, one thing to remember is that people actually have lived through a Trump administration, so they have lived under his economy and seen some of his policies. Harris was criticizing some of his current proposals. She's talking about his plan to raise tariffs, in particular on imported goods, 10 to 20%, which people will remember a lot of that tariff talk from the Trump years. Let's take a listen.
It will mean higher prices on just about every one of your daily needs. A Trump tax on gas, a Trump tax on food, a Trump tax on clothing, a Trump tax on over-the-counter medication.
I haven't heard tariffs called the Trump tax before. Like, I felt like I was hearing the debuting of some new talking points. I don't know who wants to take it, but it was a notable moment.
I do think it's effective because people don't really remember the bad things that happened under the Trump economy. And, you know, he likes to tout it, but let's remember what happened. It's rich when Republicans look at Democratic proposals who want to benefit those who need it the most, working class voters, middle class families, and they just scream communism. Yet when Trump passed billions and billions of dollars in tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires and the biggest corporations, they're like, oh, we don't need to pay for that. That's fine. And it did explode the deficit, and it didn't help middle-class voters, and it actually hurt working-class voters. And so that's what she is getting at. That's what she's going to remind people about.
Aaron, I want you to jump in here because I do think, like, language matters. So when you hear that language, should the Trump campaign worry?
About the Trump tax?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
I mean, it's easier to say tax than tariffs.
100%.
Like, that, you know,
Again, it makes it more relatable, but I
Yeah.
don't necessarily think that that is going to be the ultimate winning economic message for Kamala Harris going into this election cycle, going through this election cycle. But with the Trump tax cuts, this is something he should be messaging more on to the American people, because no matter what, no matter who wins, and Julie Grace knows this, 2025, there's going to have to be some work done on taxes in Congress because the 2017 tax cuts are set to sunset or expire. So they're going to have to do work on that. There will be a legislative vehicle. And he can say, we doubled the child tax credit. Let's do it again. We made sure you took home more of your money and that your paycheck got a little bigger. There was a 2019 analysis done by the New York Times that said the majority of Americans saw a tax cut under the Trump tax cuts. He can tell people, you brought home more money under me because we did these tax cuts. You've seen I've done it once before.
But it means
we
he's
can do it again.
explaining his record in a way that Biden was thought to be stuck doing, right? Like now, in a way, it's like he's the one having to explain. You know, Julie Grace, I want to talk to you actually a little bit about debate prep because it's hard to believe, but like with this kind of like, you know, heightened, shortened campaign cycle, we already need to be thinking about that. What have you learned about how they're conducting their prep?
Well, Tulsi Gabbard has kind of been brought on board to help Trump prepare there, and we kind of saw her already take on Harris back when she was running on the Democratic for the Democratic nomination, and she was kind of able to get under Vice President Harris's skin. And I think that the Trump team's kind of looking to harness that. I mean, that being said, I mean it's a different climate now. I feel like Trump. We saw how much Biden had to lose during the last debate, and I think it's a whole different climate than what we saw a month ago. So we know that both sides are definitely heavily prepping there, and. Well, I guess we'll watch and see how it all pans out and whether he's going to be able to kind of stay on message there.
You know, Maria, there was also like preparation for Hillary Clinton in 2016 with Philippe Reines, I think, who's going to be doing that this time around, reprising his role as Trump in mock sessions. Can you talk about those mock sessions? Like, what's the goal, right? Is it a pantomime? Is it needling? Is it, because Democrats don't want to go through what they went through with President Biden.
Sure. And I think it's a very different situation for all of the obvious reasons, right? But I think in terms of the prep, it's going to be all of those things, Audie, because they're going to practice for every single version of the Trump that could show up. And what we have seen thus far is that he doesn't know how to run against somebody as qualified and as prepared and as experienced as Kamala Harris, who also represents, in my view, the biggest political kryptonite for Donald Trump, meaning a strong woman, a woman of color, a woman who is black and of South Asian descent,
Hillary
and
Clinton
daughter of
had
immigrants.
a pretty tough experience there. Can you talk about what this means? Donald Trump does have a history of looking like a bully in this kind of environment.
But he did really well in that first debate. And debates, I believe, politically don't pick winners, but they certainly pick losers. Terry McAuliffe in the last gubernatorial race made the comment about parents not needing to be involved in children's education and that the government should do it. Boom, the Young King campaign was immediately up with an ad on it, and that was a big winner for them. They do pick winners. And heck, the debate is why Joe Biden's off the ticket now.
Yeah.
Nobody can argue with that fact. But for Donald Trump here, he does well. He does generally well in debates because he's pretty good. He's quick on his feet. And that kind of thing is really what makes somebody a good debater. But I will say, and I believe Don Jr. tweeted this as well after the first debate versus Biden, that the muted mics and the no audience were really good for Donald Trump. It kept him very focused. It kept him measured. And that was really what made him very powerful in that debate.
But very, very different opponent this time.
Very different
around.
opponent. But he's debated.
But the preparation is interesting. Preparation is everything, Mom.